Hello, everyone. This is Dave Faust. I'm the Senior Associate Minister at East 91st Street Christian Church in Indianapolis. And we're here with this podcast on behalf of the Ethos Leadership Network here at E91 Church. And today we have a special guest who's going to be sharing with us leadership lessons based on his life and experience. I'm pleased to be sitting here today with Ed Simcox. Ed earned his law degree from Indiana University. He served as the Secretary of State for the state of Indiana from 1978 to 1986. He has a wide variety of business and professional and governmental responsibilities in his history. He has served as the president of the Indiana Energy Association, has served on the board of directors for a variety of companies and nonprofits. And I have to say, because I know this to be true, there is even a section of highway named after him in LaPorte, Indiana. So Ed, it's great to have you with us today, and I look forward to asking you some questions about leadership that I think will be benefit to all of our listeners.
Thank you, Dave. I've looked forward to this for a long time. It's great to be with you.
Ed, you've been involved in leadership in a variety of settings. You've been an attorney. You've served 2 terms as Indiana Secretary of State. I know you served 3 terms on the eldership, being an elder shepherd here at the E91 Church. You've been chair of a Billy Graham crusade in Indianapolis, and you've served on the board of directors for a large parachurch ministry, Prison Fellowship. And as I said earlier, you've been the president of a major trade association and board member of an insurance company. So you have a wide variety of leadership experiences. And I want to ask you some questions today about leadership lessons that you take from those experiences. My first question has to do with the importance of the mission and the mission statements of an organization. How important is the mission to the person responsible to lead the organization?
And Dave, I think the mission is critical, and this is a great place to start any conversation about leaders, leadership, organizational dynamics, because I like to think of the mission as the main thing. And I would add to the mission, I would add 2 other qualities to it, though the mission is the center of it. Mission, vision, and values. Those are the 3 things. And as you know, we worked at those on the eldership of this church very extensively to put together what we felt was important to say to the membership, to the community, to the kingdom about what E91 was doing. And so when I think of mission, and I've dealt with mission in a number of capacities in various organizations, but the one that really strikes me is, I'll go back to 1999. I chaired the Central Indiana Billy Graham Crusade. We had 45,000 people a night on June 3 through 6 at the old RCA Dome downtown in Indianapolis. Our planning for this crusade lasted from perhaps 8 or 9 months preceding the crusade. We had many committees working. We raised $2.4 million and all the rest of it. But during the course of the planning stage, people would come to us and say, we have an idea of a theme that we want you to promote for the crusade while Dr. Graham is in town. And I remember one of those, some leading pastors in this community of churches, very well-known churches, came to us and said, we think that Dr. Graham needs to have the theme of racial reconciliation. That was a much needed theme at that time as it is today. And other people came with well-meaning ideas. We would go back as a team and we would work with Billy's people and talk about all of this. But ultimately we came out with a slogan. The main thing is the main thing. And by that, I mean that Dr. Graham, for 60 years, preached all over the world to evangelize, to bring people to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. If we were to pull off on other well-meaning themes and ideas, he would be drawn off the mission. And so we resisted all of that to stay to the mission. And it was through that experience that I really came to understand how important a mission is and how leaders have to be, and I use this word advisedly, have to be disciplined to stay on mission. It's easy to go off track. It's more difficult to say no to good things to stay on mission.
I want to come back to that mission idea again in a moment, but let me ask you, we seem to be living in a time of great uncertainty and confusion in our culture. What does it take for organizations to thrive in times like this, in times of uncertainty?
Well, Dave, we're not totally wrapped up this morning in Bible study here. That's not the purpose of the conversation. Purpose is leadership. But I have to go to two of my very favorite verses of Scripture to answer that question. One is Malachi 3:6, the last book of the Old Testament. It's the Lord reminding the people of Israel what he did for them through the ages. And 3:6 says, I am the Lord, I changeth not. I love that. It's in the the original version.
I am the Lord, I do not change, or I changeth not.
I changeth not, I do not change.
Yeah.
And what I do is when I think about that, I see that as the mission. Again, I went through the Billy Graham Crusade example. And then the other verse that I love is Isaiah 43:19. In Isaiah 43:19, we see the Lord speaking again, and he says at this point, behold, I do something new. Someone might listen to those two and say they're contradictory one to another. They're not at all contradictory, they're complementary. He changeth not, meaning that he stays with the mission, but he does something new, meaning that he will be facile in how he approaches things. The application for leaders and organizations represented by people that are listening to us today is that the mission stays. You're anchored to the mission, but you, in terms of goals and objectives, in terms of how you reach them with strategy and tactics, you may find yourself doing something new, and you need to be prepared to do something new.
Let's focus on the importance of the leader in building a strong culture. You worked with Charles Colson, the founder of Prison Fellowship Ministries. Tell us how he, as a leader, built a strong culture in his organization, how his emphasis on the mission.
Colson was, in a sense, my hero and my mentor. I worked with him for 40 years, and 28 of those years I was on his board of directors of the largest prison ministry in the world, Prison Fellowship Ministries. There was a time in the late 90s and early 2000s where Chuck was making as a salary $59,900, and that salary came from Prison Fellowship. All of his speaking royalties and fees, all of the royalties from the many books that he wrote and awards that he won, would all go into the ministry. He took none of that for himself. He took $59,900. He did that for a period of years. Well, the board met in executive session one year and said, look, this is ridiculous. Pastors of megachurches are making many times that. Pastors of these big, huge parachurch ministries, we were $50+ million a year ministry. They're making many times that. We're going to insist that he take an increase. It's not fair to him to give his life to this work and not be compensated appropriately. So he came in the room. Our chairman of our board started to explain to Chuck why we said this, and we weren't going to take no for an answer and so forth. And at a certain point in the conversation, not very far in, Chuck puts his hand up, his palm of his hand out to us, as if to say, stop, which we did. He said, you men and women have to understand something. You walk with me in this ministry. You've given your time and energy to it, just as I have in your lives. And he said, I have a lot of political enemies. When I was in the White House, I served 8 months in a Watergate-related federal conviction, for which I spent 8 months in a federal penitentiary in Montgomery, Alabama. When I came out, I started this ministry. If I take an increase, the media will have a field day. They'll say Colson is ministering because he's making money. He said, look, you got to understand, all I have is my reputation. If I lose my reputation, I lose my moral authority. If I lose my moral authority, I lose this ministry. This is my ultimate example, Dave, of a man who was so faithful as a leader to the mission that he was willing to sacrifice personally. And what's the application of that for everybody who, again, who's listening to us? It's that mission overrides everything. And when Colson did that, he set the tone and was a supreme example for those of us on the board, for the staff, for thousands of volunteers around the country, and indeed for the men and women to whom we ministered in the prisons. It's a great example.
Can you think of and share with us a contrary example of where the organization went off track because the process did not start with the leader, or the leader had the wrong perspective on the way he or she handled things? What happened as a result?
That's a great question, and I have an example, and it's a rather odd example, but you got to stay with me, and I'll make my point. When I practiced law, a man who was in public office at that time, who was fairly well known in Indiana, came to me. He was under federal indictment for income tax evasion, and he wanted me to represent him. And I wasn't familiar necessarily with white-collar criminal activities, and I told him that. He said, "I want you to represent me." And I said, "Okay, I have to get co-counsel," which I did, who's someone who did this every day. So we were working with him and preparing him for trial. And something happened at a certain point. I noticed that he was shutting down. He was receding from the conversation. He became less conversant with us. He wasn't plugged in. He seemed to be very distant. And so we both saw this, and we had to really take over and kind of substitute for him to defend him literally for his freedom. Someone might say, what's that have to do with leadership? It has everything to do with leadership. The point I'm trying to make here is that at a certain point, when things get rough, when things go off track, when we face crises in organizations in which we work, the worst thing that you can do is nothing. You have to keep moving forward, and you have to be aware that you cannot freeze. This man froze in place. It's the worst thing he could have done. We took over for him because we were his advocates. We were his spokespeople. But that isn't always the case. Leadership sometimes is lonely, and the leader has to be out there because people are watching the leader. Jim Collins, in his great book, Good to Great, the great classic book on leadership of large business organizations, said that leaders must have a ferocious will. And so I always remembered that because sometimes that's what it takes to keep going when times get tough, a ferocious will, but you must do it.
Mm-hmm. I remember he talked about the combination in effective leaders, the combination of a deep humility and a determination, a will that said nothing's going to stop us from pursuing the mission that we have.
Actually, the humility part of it I left out because I'm going to come to that, I think, later in this interview.
Okay. Ed, in most organizations, it's not just the one leader. It's good leadership involves teams. How important do you think is the leadership team, and do you have an example that would be good for others to follow?
Well, I do have an example, as you might suspect. John Maxwell wrote many books on leadership and has taught leadership around the world. And one of the great books that he's written, and I recommend it, is the 21 Irreversible Laws of Leadership.
Yeah.
And in the book, Maxwell, there's some of these are more important than others, I believe, but in the book, one of them that stuck out for me was the law of the inner circle. And by that he meant the law of the team that leaders bring around them, the importance of it, how you select people to get in it, how you bind yourselves together. I can't think of a better example than Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. 4 men started in 1947, Billy Graham, Grady Wilson, Cliff Barrows, and George Beverly Shea. They were young. They sensed that they had something special going, and they wanted to do ministry together. In Modesto, California, in a hotel. They came together and they said, we will bind ourselves together on certain principles that we will be true to if this ministry is to work and is to thrive and is to do what we think God's calling us to do. One of those was always have financial integrity in terms of fundraising, fund spending, and reporting. Another one was sexual purity and faithfulness in their marriages. And another one was never to exaggerate the size of crowds or the numbers of people who they say underwent conversions. And there were several others that were important to them. These four men, Grady Wilson died fairly early, but the other three lived into their 90s. They started in 1947. Their last crusade was in New York in 2005. 60 years of faithful ministry. The point, more than the specifics of the Modesto Manifesto, is that they bound themselves together in a covenant relationship. Mm-hmm. I have seen law offices where two people can't get along for 5 minutes as partners and it breaks up. I've seen small businesses, large businesses that break apart because of egos, because of just the pressures associated with leading and working together. But here is an example I think it ought to be taught in every business school in the country. And it's the Modesto Manifesto. You can Google it, you can study it, you can see how these men traveled together for 60 years.
The Modesto Manifesto,
yes.
What a great example. They had certain core values that they were all going to agree upon and hold each other accountable to do, it sounds like.
Yes, exactly. And I might add that Henry Ford said, coming together is easy, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And that's what they did.
So let's talk about that last point, because we know that teams do not always work well together. And if there is office discord or team members get off mission, how do you handle that? If you haven't had a group of people agreeing on core values and you step into that, or you're promoted into a role that puts you in that position, what do you recommend to do to bring people into alignment where everybody's playing for the same sheet of music?
I may surprise you a little bit with this answer. It's one of those things is one of the difficulties associated with leadership. I used to follow a man by the name of Mike Vance, who was a leadership consultant. In fact, I used him I hired him to come before my association a couple of times and give presentations. He worked with Jack Welch at GE and their great successes. He worked with Walt Disney when they founded Disney World. Mike Vance happened to be early in life a Methodist minister, and he went into this consulting business, and I was quite taken with him in his books and his approaches. He once said in one of these meetings, and the reason I raised this one, I experienced it personally in my work. He said, you want to remember this, one negative person can destroy a team. I thought, how interesting. A team of 15 people, 12 people, 5 people, one negative person will destroy a team. And so then he went on to say, you have to do one of three things when you have this going on in your organization, because it's toxic. It can destroy the mission. You'll never achieve the mission if this exists. So I'm thinking, okay, what are those three things? One is take the person aside, explain to them what's happening, explain what they're doing to the team and therefore the organization, and see if you can change them. The second one is work around them. But he said neither of these will be very effective. And he said, I have to tell you, the third one is probably the one you will resort to, and that is to remove that person from the team and perhaps from the organization. That's a tough thing. It's something that we don't often want to do as leaders. We'd rather work around and so forth. But many times it comes to that, and I'm sure that everybody who works with a team can probably think of an example of that and have to deal with it at some time or other. There's another danger with teams, and that's mission drift. And I touched on that a little bit with Billy Graham, the crusade, saying the main thing was the main thing. We can't get off target. But I have another example. I'll do it quickly. In the prison ministry, people would come to Colson over the years and would come to our board and say, we'll give you 6-7 figures of money, big donors. They say, but we want you to change your focus. We want you to go into juvenile ministry. We want you to deal with young people, get them off the treadmill of criminal activity and out of the criminal justice system before they go into the prisons. They'd say to us, you're dealing with adult offenders, men and women who are institutionalized because of things that they have done. And all of this was well-meaning, and they'd come with other ideas, wanting to give us money and support us in doing this. So we had a slogan in the ministry, and Chuck used it often. Chuck Colson used it often, and he would say, every need is not a call. In other words, there are many people doing juvenile work. That's great work. It's important work, but it's not our work. It's a need. It is not our call. Our call is to stay on mission to deal with adult offenders. And we were, again, I use this word, we were disciplined to stay the course and not to take the latest, maybe shiny object, the thing that would come before us, or the pressure or the temptation to take the big dollars to go do other things. We stayed on mission.
So it meant having the courage to say no to some good things,
Exactly.
Potentially good things, in order to stay mission focused.
Precisely.
Ed, you're a unique person to ask a question like this, but we live in such uncertain times. There's so much unrest in our culture. How can we equip our teams for dealing with uncertainty and unrest, whether it's political, economic, global, or just internal in people's own hearts? There's a lot of anxiety and stress in our employment situations, in our co-workers. How do you equip your team to deal with that as a leader?
Two answers, 2 parts to the answer. Spiritually, I think of Proverbs 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In a secular sense, I think of risk management. Risk management there are many ways to approach risk management in an organization. But one approach that I love is somewhat a bit unique, and it comes from Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration. And we were at war at that time. Everybody will remember he would hold these press conferences, and in answer to a question in one of the press conferences, they asked him how he could anticipate things that needed to be done by our military on the field of battle. He said, what we do, we have to understand 3 things. There are known knowns. In other words, there are things that we know. And he said, we list those, and we're sure that we get them right. And he said, the second category is there are known unknowns. Those are things that we know that we don't know, and we list those. We try to anticipate, head them off, deal with them. He said the third category is the most difficult of all, the unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know that we don't know.
Yeah.
And he said, we try our best to list those. So I have used that technique, those 3 categories, when I've done some major projects. And I found it to really sharpen my focus and bring me around to some really good risk management, where I can anticipate something coming down the pike, uncertainties, and then I can deal with them because I have already given them some thought.
So clarify what you know for sure, what you don't know but you need to know, and you're examining that.
That you know that you don't know.
And then there are some things, just being ready for the complete unknown. But I liked your first part, trusting the Lord in all of that to lead you through it.
Yes.
That's good advice. Before we're done here, Ed, can you cite some traits or qualities that you consider of overriding importance for leaders to possess? This is a chance for you to just say, if you're aspiring to be a leader, if you're growing in leadership, here are some qualities that you must give attention to in your life?
Well, as you know, Dave, the bookstores are full of books on this, and there are many, many qualities that people settle on. I go back to Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great, and the one topic that you referenced a moment ago, and that's humility. And then I go to one of the great prophets of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis, to make my point. C.S. Lewis wrote a book that I hope everyone listening to us goes and buys immediately after this podcast and reads it before dusk tonight. It's Mere Christianity.
Oh, yeah. It might take longer than before dusk.
Well, it might. It's the classic of the faith.
Yeah.
When I first came to Christ, someone who helped me do that sent me a copy of Mere Christianity, and I absorbed it, and it had great influence on me. But I want to read something here that Lewis says in Mere Christianity, and he took him to the 8th chapter to get to this, and the chapter is entitled The Great Sin. And it goes like this. He says, I now come to the part of Christian morals where they differ sharply from all other morals. There is one vice which no man or woman in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else. The vice I'm talking about is pride. And the virtue opposite to it is humility. Lewis goes on to refer to pride as the essential vice, the utmost evil. He does so because he says pride leads to every other vice. Pride comes before the fall. We know that admonition. And we're all familiar with that notion. It's true in life, and it's definitely true in the ranks of leadership. Two giants of the leadership of the faith and the leadership figured this out, Jim Collins and no less than C.S. Lewis. It's important for each one of us to figure it out on our own lives, where Collins goes back and says, all level 5 leaders that I have ever studied had one trait in common beyond all other traits: humility. In other words, lack of pride. Everybody, again, listening to this ought to be thinking about that one.
Ed, thanks so much for your insights today and sharing with us. I think this has been helpful to me and to everybody who's going to be hearing this. You have a couple of books, one that's already out and one that's in process. Could you tell us about those?
Well, I wrote a little, for lack of a better description, Dave, a devotional, and it's called He Leadeth Me. Title came to me in the middle of the night after I'd written this. I couldn't figure out how to title it. And so that basically describes that God led me to write it and led me to put the things in it that are in it. And so it was fun doing that. It's a compilation of devotional speeches I've given over the years. And then the biggest project I've ever undertaken in writing is a book called In the Room, and it is not published yet. I hope to have it out next year, and I'm looking forward to that. And it's kind of a memoir. It's about politics. It's about governors I've known, presidents I've known. It's about experiences I had in politics and in the faith and in the ministry.
Why is it called In the Room?
It's called In the Room because I was Secretary of State. I wasn't governor. I was always with governors and other people when they were making decisions. I was in the room, if you will, as part of those decisions when they were being made. And so I had a great opportunity to observe men and women who had to make the tough calls, who were indeed in leadership in various capacities, no less than a couple of presidents of the United States. And so though I did not necessarily do it, I'm telling the stories of other people who did and that I was a part of.
I think we all really look forward to reading your book, In the Room. Be out next year, perhaps?
Yes.
Great. Ed, thank you so much for joining us today on this podcast. On behalf of East 91st Street Christian Church and the Ethos Leadership Network, thanks so much for joining us today, and we look forward to sharing with you again in the days ahead.